Hi, Jaqueline, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Fantastic. All right. Well, we have a room full of people here who are very interested to hear what you have to say to us. And I'm going to hand straight over to you now while the technology is working. Let's see if we can get this going. Thank you.
Yes, technology is always a challenge. So first, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to present what we are doing at the level of the United Nations Environment Programme. And in particular, I will address one of our flagship reports that was launched this year in several occasions. And the title is The Global Chemicals Outlook. And if you can go to the next slide, please. That's number 2. So the Global Chemicals Outlook has so far 2 editions. The first one was launched in 2013, and the main maybe conclusion that was highlighted at that moment was the chemicals intensification happening at that moment in the world. The Global Chemicals Outlook 2, launched this year in 2019, has in a way been trying to assess what the legacies we still have and what are the solutions that we can address. One of the objectives of this outlook was to see if the Johannesburg Plan of Implementation, paragraph 23, was being achieved or not. You can find the different versions of the outlook in the web page, and if you happen to have insomnia and cannot sleep at night, the 700 pages document is very, very interesting, I can tell you, from the chemicals perspective. If you can go to the next slide. So just in a nutshell, the GCO has 5 chapters. The first chapter goes more into what's going on, what is the status at this moment, but also trying to look at the trends that are relevant in the context of sustainability. It also tries to underline where we are in achieving the 2020 goal I mentioned in my previous slide, and what can be done looking into the future. It includes concepts enabling policies, actions that can be undertaken not only by governments, but by also other sectors or stakeholders. And the last part relates mainly to how things are evolving in contribution to the 2030 agenda. So if you go to the next slide, this slide is showing the projected growth in the world of chemicals sales. This is excluding pharmaceuticals, the graphic, but including pharmaceuticals, more than $3 trillion industry is the chemicals industry in 2017. If you see the diagrams, China was in 2017 and will still be by 2030, according to the forecast, the biggest contributors to the chemicals industry in the world. To highlight here maybe is that there is some kind of growth coming in the rest of the world as well, but Asia in particular is one of the regions where this is increasing very, very strongly. If you go to the next slide, this next slide is, in a way, I always like to show it, because in 1990, and if we consider that year as having the same amount of global chemicals production and global population, so that we can reference it in 2030, you will see that the population growth will be around 60%, but the chemicals production growth is really going more than 3 times more than what happened in 1990. Why is this happening? Of course, we need chemicals, but we also need to ensure that no legacies will be, in a way, happening. The megatrends create, in a way, risks and opportunities across the sectors. What is included here? So production of pesticides and fertilizers is included, pharmaceuticals is included, perfluorinated chemicals, flame retardants, nanomaterials, and other groups as well. And the production of all of those is increasing in the different regions. The sales of the global chemicals industry, as I mentioned before, is 5.7 trillion in 2017, doubled by 2030, which is really very interesting to see. However, there are a lot of opportunities for safer products and production processes. So it will depend on the choices and policies we make to maybe work towards a sustainable future. The next slide. Why are we worried about these megatrends? And in reality, we are worried because several of these chemicals are being found in remotest areas in the different parts of our world. And the picture there is showing how this little animal, in a way, is contaminated by certain chemicals that have been banned by the Stockholm Convention, for example, but still they are moving around the world and the globe. So concentrations of these chemicals have been found in different media, not only in this little animal. The next slide. The WHO, the World Health Organization, estimated that the burden of disease from some of these chemicals in 2016 cost 1.6 million lives. That is, in a way, telling story of something that can be prevented. This report is trying to show in a way that the cost of inaction and benefits of actions can be really significant, and that is where we might need to really focus our attention. If you go to the next slide, slide number 8, you will see what this report that was presented and launched this year, as I mentioned before, has identified as issues where emerging evidence indicates risks to human health and environment. So in there, you see a list of 11 issues, and those issues, it doesn't mean that it is new to the knowledge, that they are maybe causing or some problems or that they have risks, but it's a way to highlight again that they still need to be addressed. For example, in the case of lead, you see there some group of substances. You see there also some standalone elements that addressed to better understand, but they have been recognized by the whole set of stakeholders that prepare the GCO as an issue of high concern. If you go into the next slide, number 9, in here it is important to highlight that governments are responsible, of course, in the first place for promulgating regulatory measures, but they can also play a very important role in fostering voluntary actions within industry. For example, by promoting codes of practices, environmental equality objective of guidelines, environmental releases guidelines, or maybe performance agreements. This has also been captured in this report, and what it is very interesting to note is that a lot of initiatives within supply chains in different sectors, for example, CDHC regarding to textiles, is really getting a momentum as well. Substitution goals have been set already by some public authorities and can be a driver to also facilitate voluntary actions. So as you are aware, in Europe, the listing of substances of very high concern and the candidate list for inclusion of substances under REACH are really part of that risk management actions being taken in certain regions in the world. The next slide. So the Global Chemicals Outlook also contains an assessment discussion on chemical and non-chemical alternatives. And in reality, the chemicals alternatives assessment has emerged as a very important dimension to the chemicals risk management options. It is still a forward-looking and problem-solving means of doing things, the evaluation and adoption of safer alternatives to hazardous chemicals in products and processes is still not part of many regulatory systems. But what it is important to note is that more and more it is being a requirement. So before deciding banning of chemicals or deciding on bringing in new chemicals, this assessment of chemicals and not chemical alternatives is getting a real momentum. If you go to the next slide, this slide goes into functional substitution approaches that are also part of the Global Chemicals Outlook. And in here, the idea is not to highlight what chemicals are good or bad, but to highlight that some of the chemicals that are already being substituted by other chemicals are of concern at this moment. So functional substitution approaches makes sense to open up broader societal considerations, but in any case, if safer options are not available, a lot of policy considerations need to be taken to further assess what it is needed. You go into the next slide, it's a little more about what we were talking before. The table shows the chemicals of concern, why they are considered of concern, potential substitution, but also the hazards of the substitution. So there are challenges to assessments of alternatives as well, so that informed substitution can really be done in the best manner. But issues like the chemical toxicity data is still having issues because of the gaps of information. Mixtures in formulated products is another source of information that it is not 100% available. So there is a very important to have that in mind also when some policies are being considered and discussed. National and international policies reviews identified so far that around 20 policies include provisions for substitution. That's our examples, for example, in the EU and North America. So that's a very good news. Next slide. This is talking a little about the future of chemistry. You will see two graphs in there. The first one is how the global clean chemicals market by region has been evolving from 2011 to 2020. I'm not very sure how much you can see about the color coding in there, but it's interesting to see that it's growing. So for us, this implies a lot of interest and opportunities to really maybe consider mainstreaming concepts of green and sustainable chemistry. The second graph that you see in there is how academia and has been, in a way, interested in this topic, and it's also showing the big amount, the increase of the papers that have been published. If you can go to slide 15, which is the fiscal incentives. That is the next one. Yeah. So this in here, again, there are arguments in favor of fiscal incentives. And one, of course, is that they can be really more cost effective, but also they are better at promoting innovation. Bans, restrictions, and technology standards are always part of the first thing to think, but then the fiscal incentives is right now being considered as maybe one of the best options forward. If you go to the next slide is in a way talking about voluntary actions and reporting by industry that is really increasing. And it's been in a way complemented by independent external assessments that are happening. Stakeholders can in a way take further steps to increase the transparency and the rigor of those standards that they are putting forward. But companies have in a way the right to choose to engage, assess, certify their products based on criteria considering not only economic aspect, but social and environmental topics as well. So certifications as, for example, the cradle product standard, the cradle to cradle product standards are important to consider. Next slide. In reality, what you have seen is a snapshot of the content of the GCO, but I would like to, in a way, tell you the overall message. And in here, it is always we acknowledge that chemicals are really important for our sustainable development. But we also need to acknowledge that some trends, because of how they are being managed, produced, or used, are really a major concern. And that is one of the key messages of the Global Chemicals Outlook. The second one is that the global goal that was established by Johannesburg is not going to be achieved. The good news is solution exists, but we really need to have all stakeholders working together. Urgent action is required. And the last but not least message, overall message of the Global Chemicals Outlook is that business as usual is no longer an option. So this is a lot of food for thought. And the message is that the GCO is telling the rest of the world, and if you can go to my next slide, are being considered in what we are calling at the international level as a process to establish the chemicals and waste management beyond 2020, and what are the ingredients for success for that new instrument that it's being developed. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that in 2015, the international global community, and I'm not referring only to countries, but also to all stakeholders, decided to discuss what the future of chemicals and waste management could be beyond 2020. 2020 was the Johannesburg goal that's not going to be met. So now the international community, in a way, is trying to work towards a common vision, strategic goals, targets, and indicators to see how we can see progress, but also what are the low-hanging fruits and what are the roles of the different stakeholders. This beyond 2020 has been recognized. They need to be aspirational, comprehensive, and create, in a way, room and space for all the stakeholders to engage and commit. This includes companies, workers, academia, leaders, political leaders, all the stakeholders that are needed. So this is going to be adopted in October 2020, next year, and a lot of contributions from the different sectors is happening right now. So we are in a very important moment for the future of chemicals and waste. So last slide, giving you a big thank you. I always note that delivering a presentation without seeing faces is really hard. So I appreciate you having been bearing with me through this presentation. Thank you very much.